Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're keeping lovely and cool in the hot weather out there. Enjoy it, because it's not going to last. Before long, winter will be coming. But if you need that lovely cold icy drink or that warm drink, go and get it, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it wasn't an easy decision to make, running away from home, but living with our bipolar mother had become unbearable for me and Malcolm. Now, I'm not putting a damper on bipolar disorder by any manner of means, but it affects everyone differently. In my mother's case, it was an insufferable psychological condition. Hers was extreme, driving our entire family completely insane. It really was like living with an uncontrollable wild dog that we could not restrain, especially when she became overexcitable, rambunctious and frenzied. The pendulum with my mother swang so recklessly, rather like a grandfather clock, to the left and then to the right, to such a radical extreme. The only way I can describe it was almost like going from an icy cold Arctic wilderness to a red, dry, hot desert in a matter of days. It wasn't easy to climatize to such dramatic swings in my mother's temperament and mood. It would seem that there was no middle ground for her. Unbeknownst to us, although to be fair we did have our sneaky suspicions, she was secretly throwing her lithium tablets down the toilet. They deadened her, made her feel like the nectar of life had been sucked out of her, like a hummingbird lapping up all the honey, leaving behind an empty vessel. My mother felt like that empty vessel. She couldn't abide living like that. It made her feel less than alive. When it came to my father, there is no delicate way to put this, other than to say that he was as elusive and evasive as the Scarlet Pimpernel. He had the quintessential habit of only ever arriving on the scene when my mother was in a good mood. But he always mysteriously vanished from our home when she was on one of her doleful downers. I'm not certain where my father actually went, but he would disappear sometimes for days at a time so as not to be on the receiving end of my mother's despondent melancholia or abasement. Although he loved her very much, he couldn't handle the morose bouts of clinical depression that robbed our lives of the perfect balance and harmony we all desperately craved. When she was in a good mood, he would magically reappear like the sunshine on a rainy day. He would be so pleased to see my mother when she was buzzing around with joyfulness. My brother had a sneaky suspicion that he had another love squirreled away for the days when my mother was engaged in her gloomy doldrums. We could never judge him for that, for living with my mother was not a pleasurable experience, whatever way you looked at it. If having an affair brought him some measure of comfort, then all well and good as far as we were concerned. When my mother was on a high, it was like she was hyped up on adrenaline, like a frenzied bee buzzing around a can of sweet cola excitedly. You could be forgiven for assuming she was taking drugs, but this was never the case. She became so hyperactive, her emotions would flip-flop all over the place with ludicrous ideas that she believed would radically change the world. She would jump around like a frog, darting from one activity to another with a feverish, intense passion that was always unbridled. But when the pendulum hit rock bottom again, she slipped into a deep, woeful depression, like a weighty stone plummeting to the bottom of a dark lake. When the school bus dropped us off at the top of our street, we would trek home, entering the house, feeling the blue funk of oppression. It was like a storm cloud brewing over the horizon that was threatening to cause a chaotic storm. Even our cat Moonshine would have the sense to do a runner from the house at fraught, cheerless times like this. She could sense my mother's despondent, pessimistic mood spiralling ever downwards. That cat would wisely be gone faster than a flash of lightning, and much like my father, would always magically reappear when things were changed. We had our suspicions that old Rosie Darlington, that lived next door to us, was feeding Moonshine. She was a highly intuitive cat. You could feel the heaviness in our house, which is why we never brought friends home. for when we did in the olden days, they would make comments about my mother. "What's wrong with her?" they'd say. "She's seriously weird." We always found that my mother's melancholia hung around the home like a thick blanket of dread, cloaking the entire household in an insufferable gloomy lugubriosity. My mother would be seated on the living room couch in a pair of bright pink gym pants with a loose flowing cotton top, her long wispy hair falling away from her brown ponytail. Her eyes would be rimmed by inflamed pink contours of skin, revealing that she'd been crying quite substantially. Her eyes would look bloodshot. I remember she smoked like a chimney, shaking nervously, unrestrained tears pouring down her cheeks in long, unceasing streams. The most distressing thing about these bouts of sorrowfulness for us was that she could not even fathom the source of her despair. She would sometimes snap out of those tears, becoming belligerent and incensed. Me and my brother became her punching bag. She would take out her grievous feelings on us, as misery always loves company. She would invariably blame us for all her troubles and woes, as if in some way we were responsible or accountable for her abjection. Sometimes she convinced us that we were the source of all her pain, but my father always assured us that this was not the case. "Bipolar is enigmatic," he said. "It's not easy to understand, but you children are not the cause of your mother's tearlessness, that I assure you." There were times when it felt like we were trying to save a drowning woman, but as we tried so desperately to save our mother, she pulled us down under the water with her, drowning us as well. It seemed like the weight of her despair literally sucked us dry. "Mum," I would say to her, "did you take your lithium tablets today? You know you need to take them. It's very, very important. If you don't, you're going to feel very down." "I took my tablets," my mother would insist, but I always knew she was lying. I could see the deception in her brown eyes. When my mother was on one of her euphoric highs, there was no holding her back, or even suppressing her exuberant energy. We would come home to find she had purchased the entire supermarket, and I'm not kidding either. There would be an excess of food in the kitchen, half-eaten tubs of strawberry ice cream that had melted lying on the kitchen counter. Large boxes of doughnuts with bites in them would be scattered over the surfaces. Cans of half-drunk soda pop would be lying on every available area of the house, the sugar rush only heightening her excitability. She would go on these excessive shopping binges where she would buy an excess of flamboyant, colourful designer clothes she would invariably never ever end up wearing. You would find exquisite designer purses lying strewn over the sofa, along with all these fancy cardboard bags of items she had purchased impulsively on a whim at fancy boutiques. My mother would be corybantic about all her purchases. "Look at these amazing shoes I bought! Aren't they absolutely divine?" she would pipe ecstatically, modelling them for us on the carpet, with heels so high she could barely stand, without tripping precariously all over the place. "Oh, don't I look incredible?" she would say. Me and my brother would both give each other knowing, exasperated glances. Sometimes she'd take us shopping together, going ballistic, buying everything in sight for us, in a frenetic enthusiasm. Even when we insisted we didn't want the thing, she would still insist on buying it for us. Don't get me wrong, we enjoyed being spoilt, but my mother's intoxicated exuberance would make some people think she was either drunk or completely stoned. It could become incredibly embarrassing for us. Invariably we would observe the shop assistants rolling their eyes, looking at each other and whispering, "What the heck is her problem? She's like a woman on speed." Sometimes we would come home to find my mother on a step-ladder, wearing denim dungarees, covered in paint, with a paint roller in her hands, as on a whim she decided to paint the entire living room bright purple. Naturally, we always knew the colour would only last a couple of days, until on another high she would change the colour to a bright, dazzling daffodil yellow. "I don't know what possessed me to paint the room that purple colour," she would say. "It's positively hideous, but isn't this yellow so much better? It's the colour of sunshine. It's absolutely stunning." Other times she would be in a cleaning frenzy, claiming that she was spring cleaning the house. She would scrub so incredibly hard, her skin on her fingers became blistered and raw. Our house would smell of bleach, furniture polish, and the fake bouquet of lavender deodorizer. Oh, doesn't the house look so incredible? I doubt even the White House is this meticulous. There isn't a grain of dust anywhere, not a single speck. You could literally eat your dinner off the floor. It's that perfect. It's completely spotless. Isn't it wonderful? Then there was the nymphomania, which always happened to my mother. It can be an unfortunate side effect of bipolar disorder. When she was on a high, her inflamed passions became insatiable, almost like an obsession or a desperate itch she had to scratch, rather like a drug addict determined to have their next fix. They'll pretty much do anything to get it, even stooping as low as stealing from their own family members. We weren't sure if my father was aware of my mother's indiscretions, but believe me, there were many of them. It was like she had no inhibitions or natural boundaries. She didn't discriminate. One day she would be fraternising with the pool man. Next week it would be the man that was trimming the neighbour's hedge next door. On a whim, they would be brought into our lives like leaves blown through the window by a feisty wind. I remember one time when it was raining cats and dogs outside, the old vagrant was walking down our street with his shopping trolley containing all his worldly possessions, rattling, wobbling and crashing loudly down the ribbon of asphalt. My mother, on hearing him, became rapturous. Her brown eyes danced excitedly. I groaned inwardly. I knew that look only too well. My mother dashed confidently outside onto the street in her long leather boots, wearing a short black dress that left little to the imagination. Before we knew it, the old vagrant had been escorted and whisked into our home, welcomed by my mother like a celebrity. "Does he not look like George Clooney?" she said, chuckling with pleasure. "What's your name, love?" The vagrant would mumble, "My name is Nick Oliver." "Oh, like Jamie Oliver the cook. Now I ask you kids, isn't he so handsome? Look at his wonderful beard. It's making me perfectly hot under the collar." In truth, I don't think this poor vagrant knew what was happening to him. His dirty face looked bewildered, surprised even. He gave us a gormless, toothless grin. He was wearing limp rags. His fizzy grey beard, along with his matted, tangled hair, which was swept away from his face in a bedraggled ponytail, looked worse for wear, as if it hadn't seen a hairbrush in decades. I remember he brought into the house a stench that seemed to permeate our furnishings for weeks afterwards. It was nasty, and when I say nasty, I mean nasty. It was the smell of stale urine, gin, body odour that hung around our home for days on end. It was such a profusive bad smell, but it was like my mother was blindly oblivious to it. She had no inhibitions whatsoever. She conveniently saw what she wanted to see. She led the befuddled man into her bedroom for some hanky-panky indulgent fun, of which she was clearly the instigator. He looked like his Christmases had all come at once. "I think I'm going to throw up," I said to Malcolm. "This is extreme behaviour. George Clooney, my foot. I've seen everything now." "She's definitely not taking her meds," he said. "Not if she's bringing a man into the house that smells like a sewer. She's completely off her trolley, barking mad." To be fair to my mother, she did allow the man to have a hot bath, to change his clothes. He did end up leaving our premises looking halfway decent, but he always hung around our home in the fleeting hope that my mother would pursue him again, like a lion on the prowl. My mother had absolutely no boundaries. There were not many men safe around our home when she was on one of her highs. When my father was around, he would tell us to be patient with our mother, to understand this bipolar condition of hers, to be sensitive to her plight and her feelings. It certainly infuriated us, as he was never around for the worst of it, which was always very convenient. He had absolutely no comprehension of how exceedingly difficult it was to live with my mother at times, 24/7. "You're never here, Dad. Not when it really counts," I scolded. "When it gets very bad around here. It's so convenient when Mum is having one of her depressive episodes. You and the cat, Moonshine, are nowhere to be seen. Disappeared off the face of the earth. One time she swallowed a whole bunch of pills. We had to call the ambulance. But where were you when she was having her stomach pumped?" "Now, that's not fair," said my father, flushing. "I did get to the hospital after your call. Don't you remember? Look, I admit, sometimes I do need a break from your mother. Her highs and her lows, they really get to me. They wear me down. But don't be unreasonable, sweetheart. She's a very difficult woman. It's because she's not taking her medication, I insisted. If she did, things would be so different in this household. We might actually have somewhat of a normal life. You should get her help. Try and persuade her, for goodness sake, to take those tablets. Then we wouldn't have to live in this dreadful chaos. Me and Malcolm had reached a point that we couldn't live with my mother anymore. We were at the end of our tether. You'd have to live with her to really understand. We heard about an abandoned house outside Seattle in the woods from a kid at school called Lynn, who took the school bus with us regularly. She happened to mention in passing when someone was showing a picture of a ghost caught on a camera gliding down a staircase. I tell you where you'd be guaranteed to see a ghost, said Lynn. You know that haunted abandoned house on the hill near the woods? I won't go anywhere near that place. It's so spooky. It's all in rack and ruin now. Windows broken, creepers climbing up the walls. It's far from pretty, very sinister looking. Looks like the kind of place Universal Studios would use to release their next scary movie. They wouldn't even have to make the props. They're all there. What happened to the owner, I asked. That's the funny thing, said Lynn. My mother said the woman disappeared off the face of the earth, never to be seen again. And not too long ago either. I think she's been gone for 2 years now. My mother tells me hundreds of people go missing every year all over America for all kinds of mysterious reasons. Some people believe it's to do with portals, believing that there's extra dimensions out there that can take you into other worlds. Then they think there might be extraterrestrials that abduct people, stuff like that. So no one knows what happened to the poor woman. She was there one day, gone the next. Me and my brother, upon hearing about this place, had planned our escape from home. We weren't concerned about ghosts at all. That was the least of our worries. We packed a huge backpack with food, camping supplies, which included torches, a kerosene lantern, sleeping bags and a gas cooker. But my mother, in her suspended, altered reality, would sometimes claim to see hallucinogenic spiders climbing up walls that weren't there. She would clearly be indifferent about whether we were around or not. In truth, we sneakily suspected she was unlikely to notice our absence from home at all. Nothing prepared me and Malcolm for what we were about to see. We had traipsed up the steep hilly incline, followed the old overgrown asphalt road, now completely covered in grass, that went through the woods. We were quick to become out of breath. Finally we reached the top of the hill, which was a vast flattened expanse filled with towering mature ponderosa pines that towered up into the sky like vast magnificent emerald skyscrapers framing the long road on either side. We discerned the ground beneath the trees was a dark colour, richly fertilized from years and years of the accumulated needles that had enriched the soil with a soft, lush mulch. There were mosses, ferns, pretty ground covers, boulders, and occasional patches of grass. The forest smelt of pine mingled with butterscotch or caramel. The asphalt road veered through the woods in a straight line, but on a swift right-hand turn was an old asphalt driveway, completely overgrown, with grass much like the old derelict road that was no longer in use. There were tree branches lying strewn haphazardly across the path. Our feet crunched leaves, pine needles and grass as we walked towards what I can only describe as an abandoned, forsaken house. It looked bedraggled, sad even, like it had seen better days. It was a sorrowful sight. The old brick symmetrical home was still standing. Its roof did seem to be a little bit dilapidated, windows broken, unruly creepers winding their way up the walls and through the windows like ugly tentacles. The white wooden front door was wide open. The white wooden frames of the windows were beginning to warp. The paint was crackling and flaking off. The structure of the house, its foundations and walls, still remained intact. It would not be a liability for us to sleep under this roof. That was a huge relief. We entered the house. The door creaked open. I was relieved to see that the dry wall and the insulation was also intact, but the place was still fully furnished in what at one time had been quality furnishings that had been robbed of their former elegant lustre. Now they were frayed, bedraggled, the flower print faded. Their upholstered cushioning had been flattened significantly, almost as if some of the stuffing had been eaten by mice. The long, once luxurious cream curtains, made from a quality fabric, still dangled around the windows, sweeping elegantly onto the floor, their edges framed by congealed dust. There was wooden antique furniture coated in thick layers of dust, begging to be polished, framed pictures still hanging on the walls. The curvaceous wooden staircase, although dusty, was draped in dramatic silken cobwebs. It was solid and robust. The bedrooms were surprisingly neat, just cloaked in dust, with wardrobes filled with women's clothes, hanging precariously on hangers from anoraks to jackets and dresses. The beds were all made up with outer covers, and were swathed in thick layers of dust. The main bedroom had a funky smell and appeared to look as if an elephant had been lying on the middle of the mattress, as there was a massive dent in its centre, as if the mattress had given way under a sizable weight, as if something monstrously huge had been sleeping there. It was covered with pieces of grass. We decided to avoid that room like the plague, keeping the door firmly shut to keep out the unpleasant smell. While the dated kitchen looked like it had experienced a makeover in the early 80s, consisted of a backsplash of cracked tiles in a very drab cream colour, with the occasional picture of a violet interspersed between them to reduce the monotony. It was neat, but now dappled with leaves, plant debris, dried twigs and pine needles that had been brought in by the blustering winds from a left-open kitchen window. The yellow linoleum floors were now covered in broken glass and china crockery, all clearly victims from this cantankerous, windy assault. Me and my brother began to clean up the place vigorously, to make it halfway livable, decent. We found a broom, dustbin and brush, feather duster, rags and old cleaning materials that were still usable, and for hours we cleaned up the place, bagging up any stuff we found scattered across the floor, piling all the rubbish in bin liners, which were left in a neat pile in the very overgrown backyard. I think we filled over 100 bags with rubbish. Luckily for us, there was a little stream trickling through the woods with a sprightly current that cascaded over smooth rocks, filled with the clear water suitable for drinking and cleaning. After an extensive cleaning session, the house began to sparkle, twinkle and gleam. It was a pity there was no electric power supply, but we had the floors as clean as a whistle. All the raccoon droppings and dead insects were now gone, the surfaces shining from polish, while the cobwebs had been dusted away. It was a dramatic, radical transformation that was oddly satisfying to accomplish for us. Me and my brother lived in this abandoned house for over a month, sleeping at night in one of the bedrooms in our sleeping bags on the queen-size bed in there. We walked into the small town during the day to stock up on goodies, relieved to see that no one appeared to be looking for us, as there were no missing posters around. Sometimes that concerned us as a distinct possibility if my parents realised we were missing, especially if the school informed them that we hadn't turned up for our lessons, but ours was not a normal family. So surprised we most certainly were not. Maybe there was a wee bit of disappointment on our parts to know that we hadn't even been missed. We would visit the local launderette to wash our clothes there. We both had a sizable amount of cash in our savings accounts, left to us by my father's brother, after he'd passed away from cancer 3 years prior. It was a life-saving fund for us. For the first time in our lives we began to feel the peace we'd always craved, something that had eluded us for most of our lives. We had never known what it was like to have a normal life, with a sense of stability and balance. It was like a craving that had now been satisfied. The longer we were away from my mother, the happier we began to feel. As for my father, his absence was so commonplace in our lives, we didn't give him a fleeting thought. Well, not really. We did, however, miss school and all our friends, but that could not be helped under the circumstances. I do wonder what happened to the poor lady that lived here. I'm curious as to why she abandoned her home. Why do you think she vanished? I asked my brother. My brother was reflective. Some people just want to vanish, he said. Sometimes the challenges of life or their personal relationships get too much. They decide to abandon their lives, much like we have done. I showed my brother a photograph of the woman who'd owned our house. She was standing in the front yard, which was very neat in the photograph in those days, not overgrown like it was now. She appeared to have her arms around a young girl. They were smiling in the camera. They looked incredibly happy. You know what, Malcolm? There's no sign of a girl living in this house. Do you think something might have happened to her? Possibly. Unless, of course, the lady who lived here was divorced. The father may have had custody over the child. You don't know. Maybe being away from her child drove her to the brink of despair. People's lives are complicated. Look at us. On the surface, everything is hunky-dory. But look how messed up our lives are, and have been with my mother and her erratic behaviour. You mark my words, we're not the only ones out there, with lives wrought with family difficulties. There are others like us, facing similar struggles, far worse than ourselves. One night, as me and Malcolm retired to our sleeping bags, with only the light of our oil-burning lantern to soften the extreme darkness, which we kept burning all night so that we could physically see, we were awoken to a loud banging, crashing sound. Something was thrashing around in the backyard, making a thunderous commotion. Whatever it was, it appeared to be hefty, weighty, substantial in size, very intimidating. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I was freaking out so much. I could feel spasms of terror darting down my spine like electric shocks. My insides had virtually turned to mush. I was that scared. "Hear that?" I whispered to my brother in alarm. "Malcolm, I'm scared, really scared. I promise you, there's something out there. Whatever it is, it's big. It's very big." "Calm down, sis. It's possibly only a bear. They tend to make a loud commotion. But you mark my words, he'll be gone. We have some leftovers in one of our bags out there. Bears have a phenomenal sense of smell. He's probably digging in the bin liners, tucking into that dry pecan pie we threw out. Even as I speak, they can be very noisy." "You sure he won't come in here?" I asked. "I mean, the doors are not locked. What if he pushes it open with one of his paws, comes thundering into this house? What then? He might attack us, kill us even." "Of course he's not going to come in," said my brother, trying to reassure me. "It's very unlikely. I don't think bears like confined spaces. I could be wrong, but I think they don't." I cautiously crept out of my sleeping bag, surreptitiously tiptoeing towards the window, to see if I could see the shadowy silhouette of a bear loitering around the place. I was greeted to the welcoming sight of a gleaming full moon, blazing through the dusky sky, lighting up the night like an illustrious rounded lantern, assisted in its endeavours by the tranquil light of the silvery stars. They wilfully dotted the firmament in clusters of bedazzling, glittering diamonds. Yet despite the reassuring light offered to us by the generous constellations, this night held a menacing ambience in the palm of its hands, something I'd never quite discerned before while staying here at the abandoned house. I cannot put a precise finger on what it actually was, but it was like every tree, every blade of grass, every dandelion, every wildflower, every pebble, every droplet of water in the stream, was brazenly aware of the hostile energy that cloaked everything with an inconspicuous, thick, muggy, ill-omened oppression that, although invisible to the naked eye, could be clearly felt, discerned, and physically experienced in a tangible way, like ghostly ethereal hands nudging you, with a clear distinctive warning, engaging you with an instinctive appalling revelation that within the deplorable darkness of this night, a deep grievous evil was now materializing. It was drawing ever closer, sending the most horrifying chills over my body, like a blustering cold Siberian wind. Another thing that also held my attention, like a gripping scene in a horrifying, gruesome movie, was the extreme disquieting silence. Everything was very, very still. The sounds of the stream that cascaded through the forest had dissipated, along with the chirping crickets or croaking frogs that serenaded every night for us with their joyful chorus. They had completely vanished. There were no distant sounds of owls hooting, nor were there cries of coyotes, which would have been somewhat heartening for us. All I could hear was the portentous whistling of the wind, whooshing, swishing, whizzing and whiffing through the trees as it picked up speed. But this sound was malign, airy, eldritch, like a disembodied, ethereal, ghostly wail, like lost souls moaning in the woods. Worse still, the baleful shapes of the ponderosa pines looked like tall spectral giants. Their boughs of needles jiggled in the wind, very menacingly. Beyond that we were met with silence, until the crashing and banging sound began all over again. "What the heck?" said my brother. That bear is making one hell of a commotion, just over some leftover pecan nut pie. I do know they have a sweet tooth, but this is ridiculous." With the wind picking up speed, the window in the bedroom began to bang against the wall, while gusts of cold air enveloped the room in the most repugnant bouquet of decomposition, death, and decay. It had the faint reminiscence of the smell in the main bedroom, where a substantial form had been lying on that bed. I wondered in secret horror if the bear outside had been camping in that room. The thought left me feeling very aggrieved. "Bloody hell," said my brother. "Belinda, for goodness sake, close the bloody window. It's freezing cold in here. What is that god-awful smell? It's absolutely rank." All of a sudden, we heard the front door swing open. The gusts of air blasted through the house, causing the front door to bang repetitively against the outside wall. Then we heard a thumping sound, as if something disembodied or hefty was thundering up the sweeping staircase. This thing sounded huge, gargantuan, colossal. The staircase heaved, groaning under the hefty, sizable weight. The footsteps moved towards the bedroom. I was sitting up in my sleeping bag, locked in the most horrendous fear that consumed me in a cocoon of complete, total, and utter dread. How I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. I sensed something quite dreadful was about to enter our room. My brother had lost his ability to speak. His mouth hung open, his wide eyes filled with terror. They were glued to the door, as if he too anticipated a dreadful entry that was about to burst through this bedroom. Something, someone. He could sense it as much as I could. My heart was pounding so fast, I could feel the thumping vibration in my chest. My hands were clammy, my throat dry and scratchy. Then we saw him, a mass of silver-grey hair, entering our bedroom. I have no words to describe its monstrous proportions, its hectic appearance. He was quite literally built like the Incredible Hulk. He was about the height and width of a double mattress, only significantly taller. I would say without a shadow of a doubt it was easily over 10 foot tall, and easily over 1,000 pounds. I do not believe I have ever seen anything so large. His head was so low slung on his massive shoulders, like a rising arch. This creature had no neck to speak of. Its face was somewhat human, but it was so thick, dense, burly, muscular, with arms so long they trailed low down the sides of his legs, almost touching the ankles. His whole body was covered in thick, ropey hair, with the exception of his face that was as black as coal, the texture of leather. His deep-set dark eyes glared with a hostile red eyeshine. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw us. I felt as if I was staring into the eyes of a demon. Even the smell that he brought into the room was sulphurous, noxious. It was causing my eyes to water, my body to react with spasms of nausea. The creature glared at us with such a defiant look. It felt as if he was looking through the depths of our souls. He seemed to be able to discern our very thoughts. He opened his mouth, pulling back his thin lips, and began to growl. The sound permeated my body, terrorized my senses. I felt like a deer trapped in headlights, frozen by terror, unable to move. I could sense a voice streaming into my mind. "Get out, or I will kill you!" My brother had heard exactly the same voice. In a trice, our senses were seized with a desire to survive the heinous encounter. We quickly darted down the staircase, out of the house, into the rampant yard, down the overgrown asphalt drive, to the asphalt road, down the hill to the road leading to town, where we hitched a lift from a kindly stranger. We walked the rest of the journey back home, not caring about any of the possessions we'd left behind, nor would we ever return again to retrieve them. When we returned home, we realized that our mother had failed to even establish that we had been missing for over a month, even with the constant telephone calls from our school that tirelessly plagued her with questions as to our whereabouts. It turned out she thought we'd gone to stay with our grandmother on her side, who we only visited once a year. My grandmother refused to see my mother. They had fallen out a long time ago. I think my mother must have hallucinated our visiting her. My father thought the very same. We never told them the truth, but the great news is a year later, my father divorced my mother. We chose to live with him, so we did find peace at last. We now know the creature that terrified the life out of us was in fact a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or Yeti. Could that be the reason the missing woman vanished from that old abandoned house? One can only begin to wonder. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what a fantastic story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.